The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Harold Matthews slowly pushed himself up from his worn leather armchair. At 93 years old, every morning was a victory, but this particular Thursday held special meaning. It was his weekly visit to Eleanor's grave, a tradition he hadn't broken in 15 years since her passing. Harold's movements were careful but purposeful as he made his way to the bathroom. His reflection in the mirror showed a face weathered by time but eyes that still held the sharp determination of his younger days. The medals from his World War II service hung proudly on the wall behind him, catching the early morning light. He had served as a tactical driver in the war, transporting supplies and wounded soldiers through some of the most dangerous territories in Europe. After a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, Harold pulled on his favorite navy blue sweater. Eleanor had given it to him on their last Christmas together. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned up his collar, but years of practice made the task manageable. On his way to the door, he paused to touch the framed photo of Eleanor in her garden, smiling among her beloved roses. "See you soon, sweetheart," he whispered, just as he did every Thursday morning. The garage door creaked open to reveal his pride and joy, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, gleaming in turquoise and white. Harold had restored the car himself over 3 years after retiring from his job as a high school auto shop teacher. Every nut, bolt, and piece of chrome had been carefully repaired or replaced by his own hands. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a living memory of the days when he and Eleanor would take Sunday drives along the coast. The Chevy's engine purred to life with a rich, deep sound that brought a smile to Harold's face. He had always told his students that a well-maintained engine should sound like a contented cat, and his Bel Air was living proof of that philosophy. The leather seats still held their shape perfectly, and the dashboard gleamed as if it had just rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. As Harold pulled out of his driveway, his neighbors, the Thompsons, waved from their porch. They knew his Thursday routine, and their presence was comforting. The small town of Mill Creek had changed a lot over the decades, but some things remained constant, like the way people looked out for each other. The drive to St. Mary's Cemetery usually took about 45 minutes, following Route 27 through increasingly rural landscapes. Harold enjoyed this quiet time, often talking to Eleanor as if she were sitting beside him. He would tell her about the small events of his week, the new bird feeder he'd put up, the letters from their grandchildren, or the roses blooming in her garden that he still tenderly maintained. Traffic was light that morning, which was typical for a Thursday. The old Chevy's wide white walls hummed steadily against the asphalt as Harold passed familiar landmarks. The Johnson farm with its red barn, the old covered bridge that needed a new coat of paint, and the abandoned drive-in theater where they used to watch movies in their younger days. About halfway to the cemetery, Harold noticed he was running low on gas. This wasn't unusual. He always filled up at Pete's gas station, a small family-owned place that had been there since he and Eleanor first moved to the area. Pete's son, Mike, now ran the station and always came out to pump the gas for Harold, refusing to let the elderly veteran do it himself. As Harold approached the familiar turnoff to Pete's, something felt different. Instead of the usual quiet country atmosphere, the sound of multiple motorcycle engines filled the air. Through his rearview mirror, he could see a group of bikers pulling into the station behind him. Their leather vests bore patches he didn't recognize, and their bikes were loud enough to make his windows rattle. For a moment, Harold considered driving on to the next station, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He had fought in World War II. He wasn't about to let a few noisy motorcycles change his routine. Besides, he had always believed in treating everyone with respect until they gave him reason not to. With that thought in mind, he carefully guided his beloved Bel Air toward the pump, unaware that this simple decision would lead to one of the most memorable adventures of his later years. As Harold pulled up to the gas pump at Pete's station, he noticed something wasn't right. Mike, who usually came running out to help, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a group of 5 bikers were spread across the small station's lot, their massive motorcycles taking up most of the space. Their leather vests displayed a patch showing a snake wrapped around a dagger, the mark of the steel serpents, though Harold didn't know this at the time. The morning sun caught the chrome of Harold's Bel Air, making it shine like a jewel among the dusty bikes. This caught the attention of the largest biker, a man who went by the name of Spike. He was tall and muscular, with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. Spike nudged his friends and pointed at the classic car, a mean smile spreading across his face. Harold tried to keep calm as he slowly got out of his car. His joints were stiff from the drive, making his movements even more deliberate than usual. He could hear the bikers whispering and chuckling among themselves, but he kept his focus on the task at hand, filling up his gas tank. "Hey, old-timer." Spike's voice boomed across the lot. "That's quite a ride you got there." He started walking toward Harold, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. The other bikers followed, forming a loose circle around Harold and his car. "Thank you," Harold replied politely, his hand steady as he reached for the gas pump. "She's been with me for many years." His voice was calm, but his military training had taught him to stay alert when surrounded. He noticed that one biker had moved behind him, while two others stood near his car's front bumper. Spike ran his hand along the Bel Air's fender, leaving smudgy fingerprints on the perfectly polished paint. Shame to see a sweet ride like this wasted on someone who probably drives it 10 miles under the speed limit. The other bikers laughed at their leader's joke. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly at the disrespect to his car, but he remained quiet. As he started pumping gas, he glanced toward the station's shop window. Through the glass, he could see young Mike behind the counter, looking worried but staying inside. Harold gave him a small nod, letting him know it was okay. "Hey, what's this?" One of the younger bikers had noticed Harold's license plate, the special veteran edition with its distinctive markings. "Looks like we got ourselves a military man." He said it with a sneer that made Harold's chest tighten. Spike moved closer, forcing Harold to take a step back. "World War II, huh? My grandpa was in that one too. Course, he's been dead for 20 years. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Maybe it's time for you to retire that car, old man. I'll take it off your hands for, say, $500. Harold finished pumping his gas and carefully replaced the nozzle. His mind was racing, but his face remained calm. Years of military service had taught him how to think clearly under pressure. "I appreciate the offer," he said firmly, "but this car isn't for sale." The bikers moved closer, their circle tightening. "I don't think you understand," Spike growled. "That wasn't really an offer." He reached into his vest pocket, making Harold tense up, but pulled out a crumpled wad of cash. $500 is generous for a car that'll probably end up wrapped around a tree with an old-timer like you driving it. Through the station window, Harold could see Mike picking up the phone, likely calling the police. But Harold knew that out here, help would take at least 20 minutes to arrive. He needed to handle this situation himself. With movements that belied his age, Harold opened his car door. The familiar leather seat felt like a safe haven. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced far worse threats than a group of bullying bikers, "I believe our business here is concluded." But as Harold turned the key in the ignition, he heard the roar of motorcycle engines coming to life. In his rearview mirror, he could see the bikers mounting their machines, evil grins on their faces. They weren't going to let him leave that easily. As the Bel Air's engine purred to life, Harold realized that his peaceful Thursday morning had just turned into something far more dangerous. Harold's heart was beating steadily as he pulled out of Pete's gas station, his hands firm on the steering wheel of his beloved Bel Air. Years of military service had taught him that panic was the enemy, and right now, he needed to stay focused. In his rearview mirror, he could see the 5 bikers mounting their motorcycles, their chrome and black machines roaring to life like angry metal beasts. The old veteran had 2 advantages he knew they didn't expect: his intimate knowledge of these back roads and the fact that his classic car wasn't as slow as they thought. During his restoration work, Harold had carefully upgraded several key components of the Bel Air's engine and suspension, though the car still looked completely original from the outside. As he turned onto Route 27, the first motorcycle appeared in his mirror, then another and another. They were spreading out across both lanes, trying to box him in. The sound of their engines filled the air like angry hornets. Through his open window, Harold could hear them shouting and laughing, clearly enjoying what they thought would be an easy game with an old man. Spike, the gang's leader, pulled up alongside Harold's driver's side window. The big biker was grinning meanly as he yelled over the noise. "Pull over, Grandpa. You're just making this harder on yourself." To emphasize his point, he swerved closer to the Bel Air, forcing Harold to edge toward the shoulder of the road. But Harold wasn't about to give up his precious car. This wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about standing up to bullies. He'd done it in 1944 against much scarier opponents. and he would do it again now. His wrinkled hands gripped the wheel tighter as memories of his military driving training flooded back. The road ahead curved through familiar farm country, and Harold knew every bend and turn. He'd driven this route to visit Eleanor's grave hundreds of times, in all kinds of weather. Up ahead was Miller's farm, and just past that was a tricky series of curves that locals called the Snake. Harold allowed himself a small smile. He had an idea. One of the younger bikers pulled ahead and slammed on his brakes, trying to force Harold to stop, but the veteran was ready. With timing perfected by years of experience, Harold tapped his brakes just enough to make his taillights flash, causing the biker behind him to instinctively slow down. In that same moment, he smoothly steered into the narrow gap between two motorcycles. The bikers weren't expecting such a skilled move from a 93-year-old man. Their surprised shouts were drowned out by the sound of their engines as they scrambled to regroup. Harold used this moment of confusion to press down on the accelerator. The Bel Air's engine responded with a deep roar that would have made his old auto shop students proud. "Come on, girl," Harold whispered to his car, just like he used to whisper to the military trucks he'd driven through war-torn Europe. "Show them what you can do." The Chevrolet's powerful engine, lovingly maintained and enhanced over the years, pulled ahead steadily. The bikers recovered quickly and gave chase, their motorcycles certainly faster than the classic car. But straight-line speed wasn't what Harold was counting on. He could see the Snake approaching, a series of 3 sharp curves that followed the edge of Anderson's Creek. Local teenagers often tried to prove themselves on these curves, and more than one had ended up in the creek. Behind him, the bikers were closing the gap, their engines screaming as they pushed their motorcycles to catch up. Spike was in the lead, his face twisted with anger at being outmaneuvered by an elderly man. The other gang members spread out across the road, trying to cut off any escape routes. As they approached the first curve of the Snake, Harold took a deep breath. The skills he'd learned as a young man serving his country were about to be put to the test once again. The difference was that back then, he'd been dodging German patrols in a heavy military truck. Now, he was in his perfectly tuned Bel Air, on roads he knew like the back of his hand. The first curve was coming up fast, and Harold could feel his old instincts kicking in. The chase was about to get serious, and these bikers were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong veteran to bully. The first curve of the Snake approached fast, its sharp bend hugging the edge of Anderson's Creek. Harold's Bel Air entered the turn with precision that would have impressed any professional driver. The old veteran hadn't just maintained his beloved car over the years. He practiced these roads countless times on his weekly visits to Eleanor's grave. The bikers charged into the curve behind him, their motorcycles leaning at dangerous angles. Spike, still leading his gang, was surprised to see the classic car handling the turn so smoothly. He'd expected the old man to brake hard, not accelerate through the curve like a seasoned racer. Inside the Bel Air, Harold felt a familiar calmness settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd had during the war when driving through dangerous territories. His hands moved the steering wheel with gentle confidence, while his foot knew exactly how much pressure to apply to the gas pedal. The car's upgraded suspension, hidden beneath its classic exterior, helped it glide through the turn like a much newer vehicle. "You've still got it, old girl," Harold murmured to his car as they straightened out briefly before the second curve. In his rearview mirror, he saw one of the younger bikers take the turn too wide, nearly sliding into the guardrail. The biker's face showed clear shock. They were learning that catching an old man in a classic car wasn't as easy as they'd thought. The second curve was even sharper than the first, bending almost completely back on itself. This was where Harold planned to make his move. He remembered what his commanding officer had taught him during the war. Sometimes the best escape route is the one your enemy thinks you're too smart to take. As they approached the turn, Harold did something unexpected. Instead of staying in his lane, he swung his car wide to the left, as if he was having trouble controlling it. The bikers saw this as their chance. 3 of them, including Spike, moved to pass him on the right, while 2 others stayed behind. Just as they committed to their pass, Harold executed his plan. With timing born from years of experience, he turned sharply right, taking the perfect line through the curve. The bikers who had tried to pass him now found themselves trapped in the wrong part of the turn, forced to slow down dramatically to avoid going off the road. The sound of screeching tires and angry shouts filled the air as the bikers struggled to maintain control. One motorcycle went into a slide, causing another to swerve wildly to avoid it. Spike barely managed to keep his bike upright, his boots scraping the pavement as he fought for balance. Harold didn't waste the advantage he gained. The Bel Air's engine roared as he accelerated out of the turn, its dual exhaust pipes singing a deep, powerful song. The two bikers who had stayed behind were now stuck behind their struggling companions, creating a gap between them and Harold's car. The final curve of the snake was coming up, but Harold knew he didn't need to take it. Just before the curve was Old Miller's logging road, a narrow dirt track that most people didn't even notice. Harold had used it years ago when helping Farmer Miller move equipment, and he knew it connected to County Road 8 about a mile away. Checking his mirrors one last time, Harold saw the bikers regrouping, their faces now showing frustration and anger rather than the mocking confidence they'd had earlier. They were still dangerous, but they were also rattled, not expecting this level of driving skill from their elderly target. Without signaling, a trick he'd learned in the war, Harold made a sharp turn onto the logging road. The Bel Air's upgraded suspension handled the sudden transition from pavement to dirt like a champion. A cloud of dust rose behind him, temporarily obscuring the road from the pursuing bikers. By the time the dust settled and the gang realized what had happened, Harold's classic Chevrolet was already halfway down the logging road. The narrow track was barely wide enough for his car, and certainly too dangerous for motorcycles to follow at high speed. Through the trees, Harold could hear the bikers' frustrated shouts and the sound of their motorcycles as they were forced to continue down the main road. A small smile crossed his weathered face. The chase wasn't over yet, but round one had definitely gone to the old veteran and his trusty Bel Air. The old logging road was rough, but Harold's Bel Air handled it beautifully. Dust billowed behind the car as it navigated between tall pine trees, their branches creating a green tunnel overhead. Harold knew this hidden path like an old friend. It had been his secret shortcut during his teaching days at the local high school. Through the trees, he could hear the distant roar of motorcycles on the main road. The bikers were taking the snake's final curve, probably thinking they'd catch up to him soon. What they didn't know was that Harold wasn't planning to be there when they came around that bend. As he drove, Harold's military training kicked in fully. Back in 1944, he learned that escaping wasn't just about driving fast. It was about thinking 3 steps ahead. He remembered the words of his old sergeant. A good escape route is like a good chess move. Make your enemy think they know where you're going, then go somewhere else. The logging road forked ahead. The left path, which looked more used, led to County Road 8. That's where the bikers would expect him to go if they discovered the logging road. But Harold turned right, onto a narrower path that led deeper into the woods. This trail, barely visible and overgrown, connected to Old Church Road, a route he discovered years ago while looking for a shorter way to Eleanor's grave. Harold checked his watch, 9:15 a.m. By now, young Mike from the gas station would have called the police. They'd be looking for the bikers along the main roads, which was exactly where Harold didn't want to be. He needed to get to the cemetery without drawing any more attention to himself or leading the bikers there. The car bounced over tree roots and old logging ruts, but Harold handled each bump with careful precision. His hands, though wrinkled with age, were steady on the steering wheel. The sound of the motorcycles was fading now. They'd taken the bait and continued down the main road. Eleanor would be laughing right now, Harold said softly, imagining his late wife's reaction to his adventure. She had always said he was too careful, too predictable in his older years. Well, dear, how's this for excitement? He chuckled to himself. The narrow path opened into a small clearing where loggers used to stack their timber. Harold stopped the car here, turning off the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by birds singing and the ticking of the cooling engine. He needed a moment to think and plan his next move. Taking out the small notebook he always carried, Harold drew a rough map. The bikers would expect him to either continue on Route 27 or take County Road 8. They'd probably split up to cover both roads. But Old Church Road ran parallel to both, connecting to Cemetery Lane through a series of quiet residential streets. The sound of distant motorcycles had completely faded now. Harold started the car again, its engine purring quietly. The rest of the logging trail would be tricky. It hadn't been maintained in years, but it was his best chance to reach Eleanor's grave without another confrontation. As he carefully navigated the rough trail, Harold thought about his students from his teaching days. How many times had he told them that mechanical knowledge wasn't just about fixing engines? It was about understanding your vehicle's capabilities, knowing when to push and when to be gentle. Today, all those lessons were paying off. The morning sun filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the Bel Air's hood. Harold could see the trail getting slightly wider ahead. He was nearing Old Church Road. But he wouldn't celebrate yet. His military experience had taught him that the moment you think you're safe is often when you're most vulnerable. Reaching into the glove compartment, Harold pulled out an old map of the county. He might have known these roads by heart, but having a backup plan was always wise. If the bikers were as determined as they seemed, he might need to create another diversion before reaching the cemetery. As the Bel Air approached the end of the trail, Harold straightened his shoulders. Phase 1 of his escape had worked perfectly, but the morning wasn't over yet. The next part of his journey would require all his skills, both as a driver and as a strategist. Old Church Road was quiet when Harold's Bel Air emerged from the logging trail. He carefully brushed some dust off his dashboard, a habit Eleanor had always teased him about. The morning sun was higher now, and the peaceful countryside gave no hint of the excitement from earlier, but Harold knew better than to relax just yet. Just as he turned onto the narrow country road, a familiar sound made his heart beat faster. Motorcycle engines, and they were getting closer. Through his rear-view mirror, he spotted two of the steel serpents approaching from the direction he'd just come from. Somehow, they'd found his trail. Persistent bunch, aren't they? Harold muttered to himself, his mind already working on a new plan. Up ahead was the old Mason farm, abandoned for years but still standing. Behind it was a maze of field access roads that local farmers used during harvest season. Harold had helped build some of those roads during his first years after the war. The bikers were gaining ground quickly. Their motorcycles were much faster than his car on these straight stretches. Harold could see Spike's angry face in his mirror, and the other biker was talking into what looked like a radio, probably calling their friends. That's when Harold remembered something that made him smile. The Mason farm had a large barn with doors on both sides, once used to drive harvest trucks straight through. If his timing was right, he could use this to his advantage, just like a trick he'd pulled in France during the war. Harold pressed the gas pedal harder, making the Bel Air speed up just enough to make the bikers think they were about to catch him. The old barn was coming up fast on his left. Its faded red paint and wooden walls had seen better days, but the large doors were still standing open on both sides. With perfect timing, Harold turned sharply into the barn's entrance. The Bel Air's tires kicked up decades of dust from the wooden floor as he drove straight through the building. The bikers, caught by surprise, roared past the barn entrance before they could react. But Harold wasn't done yet. Instead of coming out the other side, he hit the brakes halfway through the barn. Years of farm dust rose around his car, creating a thick cloud that poured out both doors of the barn. To anyone watching, it would look like he'd driven straight through. The bikers fell for it. Harold could hear them racing around to the other side of the barn, expecting to catch him there. Through the barn's weather-worn walls, he heard them cursing in confusion when they couldn't find his car. Harold waited in the darkness of the barn, his engine off, remembering a similar moment in 1944 when he'd hidden a military truck full of wounded soldiers from German patrols. Back then, the stakes had been much higher, but the principle was the same. Sometimes the best hiding place was the one right under your enemy's nose. After a few minutes, he heard the bikers start a frantic search of the field roads behind the barn. Their motorcycle engines grew fainter as they rode further away, following the tire tracks that crisscrossed the fields. None of them thought to check inside the barn again. Once the sound of motorcycles had completely faded, Harold started his car and slowly backed out the way he'd come in. The morning sun hit his windshield as he emerged, and he turned in the opposite direction from where the bikers had gone. Old Church Road would take him to Cemetery Lane through a series of quiet backroads. Harold patted his car's steering wheel affectionately. Just like old times, he whispered, thinking of all the tight spots this car had gotten him out of over the years. The Bel Air's engine hummed softly as they drove away from the Mason farm, leaving behind a very confused group of bikers. Looking at his watch, Harold realized he was running late for his visit to Eleanor's grave. She wouldn't have minded, though. In fact, she would have loved hearing about this morning's excitement. As he drove on, Harold began planning his route to the cemetery. He wasn't worried about the bikers anymore. They'd be searching those field roads for quite a while. The morning wasn't over yet, but Harold had proven something important. Age might slow you down, but it doesn't take away the skills and wisdom you've earned over a lifetime. The peaceful drive along Old Church Road didn't last long. Harold's ears, still sharp despite his age, picked up the distant sound of motorcycles again. They weren't behind him this time. The noise was coming from somewhere ahead. The steel serpents weren't giving up easily. They must have radioed their friends to cover all the roads, Harold thought, remembering the radio he'd seen earlier. He was only 2 miles from Cemetery Lane, but getting there wouldn't be simple now. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he considered his options. Up ahead was Miller's Crossing, where Old Church Road met with Highway 16. It was the last major intersection before Cemetery Lane, and from the growing sound of engines, the bikers were waiting for him there. Harold needed one final trick to end this chase. The morning sun glinted off something in Harold's car that gave him an idea. On his dashboard was an old CD that Eleanor had loved. Glenn Miller's Greatest Hits. Back in the war, Harold had learned that sometimes the best weapon wasn't speed or strength, but simply using what you had at hand. Slowing his Bel Air, Harold rolled down all 4 windows. He can see the intersection ahead now, and just as he guessed, 3 motorcycles were parked there. The bikers were watching the road, waiting for him. What they didn't expect was what happened next. Harold grabbed the CD and held it out his window, letting the sun hit it. The bright morning light reflected off the disc's surface, creating a brilliant flash. At the same moment, he turned his car sharply onto Old Peterson's driveway, a narrow gravel path that led behind a thick row of pine trees. The bikers saw the flash of light continue down Old Church Road, thanks to the angle of the sun and the CD reflecting through the car's back window. They immediately roared off in pursuit of what they thought was sunlight reflecting off Harold's chrome-trimmed Bel Air. Harold quickly backed his car into Peterson's empty barn, remembering how the old farmer had always said he was welcome to use it in an emergency. Through the barn's slats, he watched the bikers race past, chasing nothing but sunlight and their own assumptions. But Harold knew he wasn't finished yet. The bikers would realize their mistake soon enough. He needed to reach the cemetery before they figured out where he'd gone. Looking around the barn, he spotted something that made him smile. Old Peterson's tractor was still there, covered in dust. With the speed of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with machines, Harold got out of his car and walked to the tractor. A few minutes of checking showed him it still had fuel. He remembered fixing this same tractor years ago when he was teaching auto shop. Starting the tractor, Harold drove it out of the barn and positioned it carefully across the gravel driveway. Then he got back in his Bel Air. The trick wouldn't stop the bikers for long, but it would slow them down. Motorcycles couldn't easily go around a tractor on such a narrow path. As Harold backed his car out, he said a quiet thank you to old Peterson, who had passed away years ago. The farmer would have loved knowing his tractor was helping to stop a gang of troublemakers. Cemetery Lane was just a quarter-mile away now, accessible through a back path that connected to Peterson's property. Harold had walked it many times when visiting neighboring graves. His Bel Air wouldn't have fit through there before, but last spring, the cemetery had widened the path for maintenance vehicles. The sound of angry motorcycle engines echoed in the distance as the bikers realized they'd been tricked again. But by now, Harold was guiding his car carefully along the maintenance path, tall grass brushing against his doors. The path led right to the cemetery's back entrance. Just ahead, Harold could see the familiar iron gates of St. Mary's Cemetery. His weekly visit to Eleanor was about to happen after all, but she surely wouldn't have expected him to arrive quite like this. As he approached the gates, Harold allowed himself a small smile. He had one final surprise planned for the steel serpents, something that would end this chase once and for all. St. Mary's Cemetery was peaceful in the morning light as Harold's Bel Air rolled through the iron gates. The well-kept grounds stretched out before him with neat rows of headstones and flowering trees. But today was different from his usual Thursday visits. The distant roar of motorcycles meant his morning adventure wasn't quite over. Harold drove slowly along the cemetery's main path, past the small chapel where he and Eleanor had said their final goodbye 15 years ago. You could hear the bikers getting closer. They must have found a way around Peterson's tractor faster than he'd expected. But Harold wasn't worried anymore. In fact, a small smile crossed his weathered face as he parked his car next to Eleanor's grave. He'd chosen this parking spot hundreds of times before, but today it was part of his final plan. Just as he stepped out of his car, 5 motorcycles burst through the cemetery gates. The steel serpents had finally caught up with him. Their engines echoed off the chapel walls as they surrounded Harold and his Bel Air, kicking up dust from the gravel path. Spike, the gang's leader, jumped off his motorcycle first. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. The old man had made them look foolish all morning. "End of the road, old-timer," he growled, walking toward Harold. "No more tricks, no more running." That's when everyone heard the sound of sirens. Lots of sirens. From behind every tree and monument emerged police cars, at least 10 of them. Officers stepped out with their hands on their weapons, surrounding the surprised bikers. The steel serpents looked around in confusion, realizing they were completely trapped. "Good morning, Harold," called out Chief Wilson as he stepped from behind the chapel. "Right on time, as usual." The police chief smiled and nodded at the old veteran. "Mike from the gas station called us about these troublemakers. When you didn't show up at your usual time, we figured you'd lead them here eventually." Harold nodded back. "Thank you, Chief. I remembered you mentioning that the steel serpents have been causing trouble in 3 counties. Thought you might appreciate having them all in one place." The bikers' faces showed sudden understanding. The old man hadn't been running away. He'd been leading them into a trap. All his moves, from the chase through the snake to the barn trick, had been designed to keep them following him until they reached the cemetery. "You see," Harold said, turning to Spike, "I visited my Eleanor every Thursday at exactly 10 a.m. for 15 years. Everyone in town knows it. When I didn't show up on time, the police knew something was wrong. They just needed all of you in one place." Officers moved in quickly, handcuffing the stunned bikers. Chief Wilson walked over to Harold, shaking his head in admiration. "You know, most people would have just called 911 right away." Harold shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "Well, Chief, when you've driven supply trucks through Nazi-occupied France, a few bikers don't seem so scary. Besides," he added with a small smile, "Eleanor always said I needed more excitement in my retirement." As the police led the steel serpents away, Harold turned to Eleanor's grave. He carefully placed fresh flowers in the vase, just as he did every Thursday. The morning's excitement hadn't made him forget the real reason for his visit. "Quite a story to tell you today, dear," he said softly, straightening the flowers. Around him, the cemetery returned to its peaceful state as the police cars drove away with their prisoners. The next day, Harold's adventure was the talk of the town. The local newspaper ran the story on its front page. 93-year-old veteran outwits biker gang. Young Mike from the gas station proudly told everyone how it had started, and Chief Wilson admitted it was the most ingenious citizen's arrest he'd ever seen. But Harold didn't pay much attention to the excitement. The following Thursday, he was back at the cemetery at exactly 10 a.m., just like always. His Bel Air was freshly washed, with all traces of the chase cleaned away. The only difference was that now, when he drove through town, people smiled and waved with new respect for the elderly veteran who had proved that wisdom, courage, and a well-maintained classic car could overcome any challenge.